The air in Boston that October felt like something out of a dream. Crisp but gentle, golden leaves swirling in the wind, as if the city itself had decided to celebrate with us. That was the day I became Mrs. Claire Donovan. I can still see the lights of the grand ballroom, the gleam of crystal glasses, the hum of music as guests mingled beneath sparkling chandeliers. But what I remember most clearly is the way Michael Donovan's hand felt wrapped firmly around mine as we said our vows. Everything about that wedding shimmered with perfection. My parents had insisted on doing it properly. Lavish flowers, an elegant string quartet, a guest list that seemed to stretch for miles. And Michael's family was just as proud. Yet for me, the magic wasn't in the champagne toasts or the expensive decorations. It was in the way Michael looked at me when I walked down the aisle, as though I were the only person in the entire world. We had been together for 3 years before that day. 3 years of stolen weekends, of late-night walks along the Charles River, of long conversations about the kind of future we wanted. When he proposed to me in the glow of the city lights, I didn't hesitate for a second. I knew he was the one. Michael was already carving out a reputation as a promising young attorney, the kind who seemed destined to make his mark in Boston. I had just finished my degree in communications and landed my first real job. We were young, ambitious, and in love, ready to build something lasting together. The wedding felt like the culmination of every dream I had carried since I was a little girl, and the honeymoon that followed only deepened that feeling. Michael had a way of making even the simplest moment feel special, whether we were trying exotic food in hole-in-the-wall restaurants, holding hands as we navigated crowded city streets, or whispering to each other about how lucky we felt. Every gesture seemed to reinforce our bond. I believed him when he told me I was his whole world. I believed in us. The first years of our marriage were as close to perfect as I could ever imagine. Our apartment in Boston wasn't big, but it was ours. We filled it with books stacked in messy piles, framed photographs from our trips, and the comforting scent of candles I insisted on buying each season. Michael worked long hours at his law firm, often buried in case files that seemed to stretch forever, but he always came home with a smile. He would drop his briefcase by the door, lean down to kiss my forehead, and ask about my day as if nothing in the world mattered more. On weekends, we carved out time just for us. Sometimes that meant simple walks through Boston Common, sometimes trips we saved for months to afford. Cape Cod in the summer, Maine in the fall. Each trip became a ritual of love, Michael planning every detail with quiet precision, and me marveling at how he somehow managed to balance work, responsibility, and still make me feel cherished. Friends often joke that we acted like newlyweds even years after our wedding. I didn't care how it looked. It was true. There were times I would catch him watching me across a room, his gaze soft but steady, and I would blush like a schoolgirl all over again. Michael carried himself with a calm strength, a patience that was rare in a world where tempers so often flared. Even when things went wrong, missed trains, sudden downpours that ruined our plans, little accidents, he never lost his composure. Instead, he would laugh, improvise a solution, and somehow manage to make me laugh too. More than once, I told myself that if men with angelic tempers truly existed, then I had been lucky enough to marry one. Michael wasn't just my husband, he was my partner, my safe place, my miracle. Looking back now, it almost hurts how flawless those years felt. I had no reason to doubt him, no reason to fear what the future might hold. At that time, if someone had asked me to describe my life in a single word, I would have said, blessed. Because that was exactly how it felt. As though I had been given something rare, something fragile, something nothing in the world could ever take away. Or so I thought. It was just after our third anniversary when Michael came home one evening with a look in his eyes I had only seen a handful of times before. It was the expression he wore when he stood on the edge of something monumental, both thrilling and dangerous. He hung his coat by the door, loosened his tie, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of something extraordinary. "Claire," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I've just taken on a case unlike anything I've ever handled before. This one could define my career." He wasn't exaggerating. His new client was Richard Caldwell, one of Boston's wealthiest businessmen, a man whose name appeared in financial magazines and who had entire museum wings named after him. The case? A divorce. Not just any divorce, but one involving assets worth hundreds of millions, sprawling mansions, priceless art collections, antique jewelry, and investment portfolios that stretched across continents. The wife was demanding half of everything. Michael told me, almost with disbelief, that she had never worked a single day or contributed to building Caldwell's empire, yet she was relentless, manipulative, determined to take as much as she could. I listened quietly as Michael described the mountain of documents, the endless meetings, the sheer magnitude of what was at stake. Part of me was proud, so proud. At such a young age, to be trusted with a case of that scale spoke volumes about his talent and reputation. He was no longer the promising young attorney people once whispered about. He was becoming a force to be reckoned with. But another part of me couldn't quiet the unease growing in my chest. The way he spoke about the wife, the cruelty in her tactics, the venom in her demands, made me worry about what he was stepping into. "Are you sure this is worth it?" I asked one night as I watched him surrounded by files and briefs long past midnight. "It sounds exhausting, Michael. Dangerous, even, in its own way." He smiled at me then, that calm, reassuring smile I had fallen in love with years ago. "Claire, this is what I was trained for. I know how to handle people like her. And besides, it's not just about money. It's about justice. Richard built everything with his own hands. She's trying to take what she never earned." I wanted to believe him, and for the most part, I did. Still, as the days passed and I watched him bury himself deeper and deeper into depositions and negotiations, I couldn't shake the knot forming in my stomach. When Michael finally met with Mrs. Caldwell face to face, the stories he told me afterward made my skin crawl. He described how she carried herself like royalty despite coming from nothing, how she demanded a lifestyle that would drain her husband financially if she succeeded. But Michael, with his sharp mind and unshakable composure, dismantled her arguments one by one. He reminded her that most of the assets had been acquired before the marriage, that her luxury had been funded entirely by her husband's effort. In the end, she folded. She accepted a lavish apartment and a generous monthly allowance, but nothing close to the half she had been fighting for. Michael came home that evening with a quiet spark of triumph in his eyes. He don't gloat, that wasn't his style, but I could hear the relief in his voice. "It's settled," he said, slipping off his watch and setting it on the counter. "The papers will be signed tomorrow." True to his word, the settlement was finalized. Richard Caldwell was ecstatic, embracing Michael like a savior and immediately arranging for a staggering transfer to his account. But for Michael, it wasn't just the money. It was validation, recognition, a young lawyer who had proven himself in one of the city's most high-stakes cases. That Friday evening, Michael called me on his way out of Richard's office. His voice was warm, though a little tired. "Claire, I'll wrap everything up tomorrow morning, and then I'm coming straight home. No more late nights, no more endless calls, just us." I smiled as I set the dinner table, believing him, believing that once this storm had passed, we would return to the life we loved so much. I wanted that night to be perfect.
On my way home, I stopped by the market to buy his favorite wine and fresh ingredients for roasted chicken with herbs, the kind of meal that had always been our little celebration. By the time I was lighting the candles and dimming the lights, the apartment smelled warm and inviting. I imagined the look on his face when he walked in, saw the table set, and realized how much I had been waiting for him. Then my phone rang. It was Michael. His voice came through the line, low and familiar. "I'm in the garage now, Claire. Give me 15 minutes and I'll be home." I laughed softly, telling him not to rush. "Drive safe. Dinner's almost ready." The call ended, and I felt that flutter of excitement, the simple joy of a wife waiting for her husband. But 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 40. I dialed his phone, expecting him to apologize for traffic. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. Something didn't feel right. Michael always kept his word. Even if he was delayed, he always called. By the time an hour had passed, my hands were trembling. I phoned the parking garage where he usually left his car. The attendant confirmed my worst fear. "Mr. Donovan picked up his car about an hour ago. He should have left already." That's when the panic fully set in. I threw on a coat, ran downstairs, and scanned the streets as if he might appear out of the shadows at any moment. I walked block after block, whispering his name under my breath. Nothing. Boston suddenly felt too big, too dark, too hostile. My calls to my parents came out in broken words. The police arrived soon after, asking for details, what he had been wearing, what car he drove, when I last heard his voice. Their questions sounded surreal, like I was describing a stranger instead of the man I had kissed goodbye that very morning. Hours passed in a blur of phone calls and tears. My parents rushed over to sit with me in our small apartment, which now felt unbearably empty. The chicken had gone cold, the wine sat unopened, and every creak in the hallway made me jolt, hoping it was him. But midnight came. Then 2 a.m., then dawn, and still no sign of Michael. That night marked the beginning of a nightmare I could never have imagined. My husband had vanished as though the earth itself had swallowed him whole. One moment, he was calling me from the garage, promising he was on his way home. The next, he was gone without a trace.
The days after Michael's disappearance bled into one another, a haze of grief and disbelief. The police opened an investigation, but their words were cautious from the start. "Adults have the right to disappear," one detective reminded me, his tone gentle, though the doubt in his eyes betrayed his belief that something was terribly wrong. They checked traffic cameras, questioned garage attendants again, canvassed nearby streets. But there was nothing. No witnesses, no accident reports, no trace of his car. It was as though Michael had vanished into thin air. I couldn't accept it. I called his phone every hour, leaving voicemail after voicemail until my voice went hoarse. I contacted every local hospital, imagining he might have been in an accident and was lying in a bed somewhere waiting for me. Each time the phone rang, my heart leapt, only to crash when it turned out to be a friend, a neighbor, or another officer with no news. My parents and Michael's parents stepped in quickly, trying to keep me afloat when I felt myself unraveling. Together, we hired a private investigator, someone who promised to dig deeper than the police could. We printed posters with Michael's face, plastering them across Boston. Lampposts, grocery stores, subway stations. I uploaded his photo online, begging strangers for any information, no matter how small. Messages came pouring in, some from people offering sympathy, some false leads that led nowhere. None of it brought him back. Each morning I woke hoping it had all been a nightmare, that I'd roll over and find him beside me, breathing softly, the way he always did before work. But the bed was cold and reality was merciless. Weeks stretched into months, and with them came a slow, steady collapse of my mind. Questions gnawed at me relentlessly. Where was he? Was he hurt? Had someone taken him? They circled endlessly until I could no longer sleep, no longer eat. My body felt hollow, my hands shook without warning, and every corner of our apartment screamed of his absence. His shoes by the door, his jacket draped across a chair, the scent of his cologne lingering faintly in the closet. Eventually, my parents made the decision for me. One evening, they guided me gently into the car and drove me to the hospital. I was admitted for treatment of severe depression and exhaustion. Lying in that sterile white room, I felt like I had failed, not just as a wife, but as a human being. I couldn't find him. I couldn't even hold myself together. Nights in the hospital were the darkest, when silence pressed against me and I wondered if Michael was lying in some equally cold place, waiting for me to save him. But slowly, with therapy and medication, I began to surface from the depths. When I was discharged weeks later, nothing in the world had changed. Michael was still gone, but something inside me shifted. I realized I had two choices: drown in grief or find some way, any way, to keep moving. My doctor urged me to build routines, to find work that would occupy my hands and my mind. At first, it felt impossible. How could I focus on anything when the only thing I wanted was to find Michael? But survival demanded it. So, I took on part-time jobs, small tasks that forced me out of bed in the mornings. It wasn't about money, it was about staying alive. The busier I was, the less room there was for the crushing silence of our empty apartment. I told myself it wasn't moving on, it was simply moving forward. That was when I accepted a position helping an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Blake, a former ballet dancer who had once graced the great stages of New York. She lived alone in a modest but charming apartment near the Charles River. Age had stolen much of her mobility, and she needed someone to cook, clean, and run errands. At first, I felt clumsy, like an intruder in her world of faded posters, dusty trophies, and the faint scent of lavender that hung in every room. But Eleanor welcomed me warmly, with a kindness I hadn't realized how much I needed. Little by little, I found comfort in the rhythm of caring for her. The work didn't erase the pain, but it dulled the sharp edges. I swept floors, prepared meals, and listened as she reminisced about the elegance of a lifelong past, how she had danced under blinding stage lights, how she had loved and lost and yet kept moving. She didn't know the full details of my tragedy, but sometimes when she caught that faraway look in my eyes, she would pat my hand gently and whisper, "You'll find your way too, dear. Grief never leaves us, but it teaches us to move." Her words stayed with me. Over time, word spread that I was reliable, hardworking, and other families in Boston began calling me for help. Deep cleaning, house sitting, organizing. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy. My days filled with tasks that left my body tired enough to sleep at night. Still, no matter how hard I tried, Michael was always with me. A song on the radio, a suit hanging in a client's closet, the scent of his cologne drifting from a stranger passing by. Each memory was like a ghost reaching out, pulling me back to him. Some nights I woke convinced I'd heard his key turning in the lock, only to be met with silence. 2 years passed in this strange limbo. My heart learned to beat again, but never in rhythm. My life moved forward, but always with one foot stuck in the past. And then, on an ordinary day, everything shifted. I had been hired to clean a grand estate in Back Bay, a sprawling townhouse owned by a woman named Catherine Sterling, whose name carried heavy weight in Boston's business circles. And it was there, in that mansion, that my world turned upside down once again. The Sterling estate in Back Bay was unlike any place I had ever worked before. From the outside, it looked like something out of a magazine. Tall windows framed by ivy, an ornate iron gate, and stone steps that seemed to whisper of wealth and power. Inside, it was immaculate in a way that suggested money had polished away every imperfection. Marble floors stretched in gleaming rows, staircases spiraled like sculpture, and walls were adorned with expensive art I didn't dare linger on for too long. I had been hired by Catherine Sterling, a woman whose name carried weight in Boston's elite circles. Even before meeting her, I'd heard the way people spoke of her, with a mix of admiration and wariness. She was the kind of woman who always seemed to get what she wanted. That afternoon, I moved through the grand library with a dusting cloth in hand. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the polished wood. I had just reached for a vase when I froze. A voice drifted down the hallway, deep, steady, familiar in a way that stopped my heart cold. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. I stood rooted to the spot, straining to hear. The cadence, the tone, it was Michael's voice. My Michael. The sound cut through me with the force of a blade, sharp and undeniable. For a moment, I nearly dropped the vase in my hands. My pulse thundered in my ears as I held onto the shelf for balance, terrified that my mind was playing tricks on me again. No, it's impossible. He's gone. He's been gone for 2 years. I shook my head, desperate to steady myself. Maybe it was a trick of memory, a cruel echo summoned by loneliness. That had to be it. And yet my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I told myself over and over that it was just a ghost of my imagination. But when Catherine called me again weeks later to return to the townhouse, dragged, twisted inside me like a knot I couldn't untangle. Still, I went. Work was work, and I needed to keep going. That day, I was wiping down the marble counters in the kitchen when the sound of the front door opening made me jump. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, measured, confident, achingly familiar. I turned, cloth still in my hand, and froze. He walked in as though he belonged there, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive suit that fit him perfectly. My world tilted violently. It was him! The face I knew better than my own, the man I had kissed goodbye the morning he vanished. But he wasn't the same. His dark hair was shorter, neatly styled, a jagged scar traced across his left cheekbone, and his eyes, once warm and steady, were distant, guarded, as though a wall had been built between us. When his gaze landed on me, there was no flicker of recognition, no soft smile, no spark. Only a faint narrowing of his eyes, suspicion flashing across them as though I were an intruder in his world. "Mr. Alexandric?" Catherine's voice floated from the hallway, smooth and polished. "You're home early." Alexandric. The name struck me like a physical blow. My mouth went dry as I whispered under my breath, barely audible, "Michael." But he didn't react. He glanced at me briefly, nothing more than polite acknowledgement, and then nodded toward Catherine. Without a word, he walked past me as though I were invisible. Something inside me shattered. I stumbled through the rest of my tasks, my hands trembling so violently that I nearly dropped dishes, nearly broke glass. My chest felt hollow, my breath shallow. When I finally stepped outside into the cold Boston air, it hit me like a slap, stimming and merciless. I could barely breathe. That night, I sat at my parents' dining table, recounting everything in broken fragments. "It was him," I insisted, gripping my mother's hand as if it could anchor me to sanity. "The scar, the voice, the way he moved. It was Michael. I know it was him, but he didn't know me." My father frowned, exchanging a worried glance with my mother. "Claire, grief can play cruel tricks. Are you sure?" "I am sure." My voice broke, tears streaming down my face. "I know my own husband." They didn't argue further, but I saw the doubt lingering in their eyes, and it cut almost as deeply as Michael's empty stare.
That's when I called the private investigator again, desperation burning in my voice. I begged him to follow Catherine Sterling, to uncover the truth about the man she called Dmitry Alexandrich. Weeks later, the investigator returned with findings that left me cold. The pieces fit together in a way that made my skin crawl. Michael hadn't left me. He hadn't abandoned our life. The night he disappeared, he had been attacked, beaten, and left unconscious near the entrance to her estate. She had found him, taken him in, and when he awoke, his memory was gone. With her influence and wealth, she arranged for new documents, a new identity, and a new life. And just like that, my husband became hers. Hearing it out loud left me numb. Michael hadn't chosen to disappear. He hadn't chosen Catherine. He had been stolen, reshaped into someone else's story. The night I received the report, I barely slept. My hands shook as I read the pages over and over, tears smearing the ink. By morning, I had made my decision. I walked into the police precinct with trembling hands but a steady voice, carrying every piece of evidence I had: photographs, timelines, the investigator's written statement. "Dmitry Alexandrich," I said firmly, my voice shaking only at the edges, "is my husband, Michael Donovan. He disappeared 2 years ago. He didn't run away, he was taken." The detective studied the files silently, his expression unreadable. For a moment, fear gripped me that he would dismiss me as a delusional widow clinging to false hope. But then his eyes hardened, his tone shifting. "We'll look into this, but you have to understand, it won't be simple." I nodded, my chest tight with equal parts dread and determination. For the first time in 2 years, I felt something I thought was gone forever.
The police moved quickly once the evidence was laid before them. Michael Donovan, or Dmitry Alexandrich, as Catherine Sterling had named him, was ordered to undergo a full medical evaluation at Massachusetts General Hospital. They needed to confirm whether the scars, dental records, and timelines aligned with the man I claimed was my husband. I will never forget the moment I saw him wheeled down the sterile hallway toward the examination room. My palms were damp, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. For 2 years, I had dreamed of seeing him again, my Michael, alive, and now he was here. Yet he looked at me with polite confusion, as though I were a stranger hovering too close. "Michael," I whispered, stepping forward. "It's me, Claire." His eyes lingered on mine, searching, but there was no recognition. Finally, he shook his head gently. "I'm sorry, I don't know you." The words cut deeper than any knife. I held up a photograph of our wedding, pointing to the two of us smiling beneath the autumn leaves. He studied it with furrowed brows, his expression tense. But instead of relief or memory, there was only unease. His gaze drifted past me until it landed on her, Catherine Sterling, standing in the corner with arms crossed and eyes shop. When his eyes softened at the sight of her, I thought the floor might give way beneath me. "That's my wife," he said simply. The court ruled that while his memory rehabilitation continued, Michael would stay with me and my parents. It was surreal preparing a guest room for him, my husband, who now lived under our roof like a polite stranger. He was courteous but distant, careful in his words, cautious in his movements. He thanked my mother when she cooked, nodded politely when my father tried to chat about sports, but his eyes remained clouded, as if he were mapping out a world that didn't fit. With me, the tension was worse. When I approached him with photo albums, his posture stiffened, but he didn't turn away. One evening, I laid the album on the table, my hands trembling. "This was our wedding," I whispered, pointing to the picture of us beneath that golden canopy in Boston. His younger self beamed from the photo.
eyes full of love. Michael studied the image carefully. For a flicker of a moment, something softened in his expression, a shadow of recognition, but then it was gone. "It feels familiar," he admitted quietly, "but I can't place it." I swallowed the ache in my throat and tried again. I told him about our trips to Cape Cod, about the night he carried me barefoot across the beach when my shoes broke. I reminded him of how he stayed up all night rehearsing with me for a big presentation, even though he had court the next morning. He listened intently, tilting his head at times, as if the stories brushed against the edges of his memory. But when I asked if he remembered, he shook his head, with frustration in his voice. "I want to, Claire, but it's like trying to grab smoke." Meanwhile, Catherine refused to let go. She showed up at the hospital during his checkups, hovering with flowers and expensive gifts. Once, she even appeared at my parents' doorstep, demanding to see him. I slammed the door in her face, but her words lingered like poison. "He's mine now. You're clinging to the past." At night, I often found Michael standing by the window, shoulders tense, staring into the darkness. One night, he confessed in a low, strained voice, "It's like I'm split in two. Part of me feels safe here with you, but another part feels like I owe her everything. She saved me." I wanted to scream that Catherine had only taken advantage of his broken state, but I bit my tongue. His pain was real, his confusion undeniable. All I could do was stay close, reminding him of the life we had built, praying that somewhere inside, my Michael was waiting to come back. It was one of his doctors who suggested a new approach. He explained, "Sometimes memory isn't restored by stories or photographs. Sometimes it takes a place, a sensation, to trigger what the brain has locked away." His words stayed with me. So one evening, I drove Michael back to the parking garage where his life with me had ended 2 years ago, the place he had last called me, promising he was on his way home. The structure was unchanged. Concrete pillars, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the faint smell of gasoline. To me, it was a graveyard of hope. To Michael, it was still just a parking garage. We stepped out of the car, our footsteps echoing. I led him toward the spot where his car had been parked that night. As we reached it, his body stiffened. He gripped the railing, his breath quickening. Then it happened. He staggered, clutching his head, and let out a strangled sound. His knees buckled, and I caught his arm to steady him. His eyes went wide, pupils blown, tears spilling before he could stop them. "I remember," he gasped. The images poured out in fragments. Men stepping out of the shadows, fists slamming into his ribs, the metallic taste of blood, hands dragging him across cold pavement. Then blackness. He remembered waking up in an unfamiliar room, Catherine telling him his name was Dmitri, convincing him his past was gone. His voice broke as he pressed his forehead against my shoulder. "Claire, I didn't leave you. I never left you." Tears blurred my vision as I wrapped my arms around him, holding on as if I could make up for every lost year. "I know," I whispered fiercely. "I never stopped believing." For the first time since his disappearance, I felt Michael's embrace, not as a stranger's, but as my husband's. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe in something more than grief.
Once Michael's memories returned, everything moved quickly. His testimony, combined with the private investigators' earlier findings, gave the detectives a clear direction. The pieces of the puzzle no longer floated in the dark. They clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The attack that had stolen 2 years of our lives was no random act of violence. It was orchestrated, and the source was closer than I could have imagined. It was the Harrington family, relatives of Richard Caldwell's ex-wife, furious over the divorce settlement Michael had secured. They had money, power, and enough bitterness to order revenge. In their minds, Michael had humiliated them in court. Silencing him was payback. Hearing it spelled out made my blood run cold. I pictured it all too clearly. Michael stepping into the garage that night, unaware of the shadows waiting, unaware that his life was about to be ripped away. The men they hired were eventually tracked down, arrested, and charged. With them came the names of those who had pulled the strings. Justice, long overdue, was finally in motion. The day the indictments were announced, Michael and I stood together outside the courthouse. Reporters swarmed us, microphones shoved forward, cameras flashing, but I barely noticed. All I cared about was the way Michael's hand tightened around mine, grounding me in the reality that we had survived, that he had survived. From there, the process of restoring his identity began. I watched as official documents were stripped of the false name Dmitry Alexandrich and replaced with the truth, Michael Donovan. Seeing his name again, etched in black ink on paper that could never erase it, felt like breaking a chain that had bound us both. Catherine Sterling fought it bitterly. She came to hearings with her team of attorneys, her composure unshaken, her beauty immaculate. She argued that she had saved him, cared for him, loved him, that he had chosen her. But in the end, even she couldn't deny the evidence. He wasn't hers. He never had been. I still remember the look on her face when the ruling was final. Beautiful, proud, but utterly devastated. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked at Michael one last time. Then she turned away. It would be easy to hate her, to brand her a villain and nothing more. But part of me, against my will, understood. She hadn't orchestrated the attack. She had found a broken man and built her life around him. Losing him must have felt like losing the ground beneath her feet. For us, though, it was the beginning of something new. Michael moved back into our apartment in Boston. It felt surreal welcoming him home, not as a guest this time, but as the man I had once built a life with. Still, it wasn't simple. The memories were there now, but fragile, like glass, shattered and glued back together. Some mornings he woke with fragments missing, and I reminded him patiently. Other days he remembered things I had long forgotten. Private jokes, tiny rituals, and we laughed until tears filled our eyes. We learned to live slowly, deliberately, to savor what we had nearly lost. Dinner at home became sacred, candles flickering between us. Walks through Boston Common felt like quiet celebrations. Even the ordinary moments folding laundry together, sharing coffee in the morning carried weight they had never carried before. We no longer assumed time was promised. We cherished it for the fragile, precious gift it truly was. Looking back, I realized our story was never about perfection. Those early years when I thought we had everything, when life felt flawless, those weren't the moments that defined us. What defined us was resilience, choosing each other, even when the world tried to tear us apart. Love doesn't erase suffering. It doesn't shield us from betrayal or loss, but it endures. It heals. It rebuilds. Sometimes it even pulls us back from the edge of forgetting. I once thought I had lost Michael forever, that the man I loved had been erased from the earth, or worse, from his own memory. But now, every time he takes my hand, every time he says my name with recognition in his eyes, I know the truth. Real love can survive even the cruelest storms. It can overcome loss, deception, and even the shadows of memory itself. And in that knowledge, I finally found peace.